Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into the shocking story of Don Johnson. At one point, he was the smoothest man on. He had a television, fast cars, and everything. Gaudy suits, and all the women in Hollywood wanted to be with him. The eights belonged to Johnson, but what transpired? When the cameras have finished recording, well, how a man goes from prime to shock time royal to almost losing their house. He was bringing in enormous sums of money for each show and the next. He was negotiating in a desperate manner simply to live, and as the world praised behind-the-scenes legend that Don was going through a particularly devastating facts. But how did he lose everything? And how's it at 75? After you hear what he's saying, he's coping went through, you won't ever see him again. Once more, from filthy poverty to Hollywood gold. Prior to discussing his downfall, that you must truly comprehend how well-known Don Johnson was in the. If you were looking for a style, the 1980s symbol, it would be hard to avoid thinking about Miami Vice's Don Johnson, who was renowned for his pastel shirts and white suits. And without socks, he essentially created the look. It was so well known by the late Don was earning millions of dollars a year in the 1980s. Had chart-topping popular TV series. He was wealthy with songs and even movie agreements. Don is well known and at the top of the world. Was wealthy and led a life that was greater than life. He possessed numerous opulent and incredibly costly properties, such as a huge Colorado ranch, a home in Hollywood, and an opulent Miami home. The only well-known names in the car collection consider Porsches, Lamborghinis, and Ferraris. He was enjoying the American way of life, but in a greater extent from the business. He maintained the impression that he was on another level. We are discussing Jack Nicholson, Melanie Griffith, and Barbara Streisand, and even Leonardo DiCaprio at a young age, who eventually began dating Dakota, his daughter. Don Johnson's life appeared to be ideal, till everything fell apart. But the pastel clothes before the boats and Don Johnson's million-dollar paychecks. Life didn't resemble Hollywood stars at all. Actually, he traveled from around the same distance, Donnie, from Hollywood as you could get. On December 15th, Wayne Johnson was born. 1949, in the small Missouri village of Flat Creek. His mother was in the middle of America, only 16 years old at birth, and when his father was just 19, they were essentially children raising a child. Despite having difficulty to make ends meet, finances were limited, and life was difficult for Don when he was younger. He and his family relocated to Wichita, Kansas. Didn't really have any dreams as a child. His family was working class when he was a child. Occasionally, just making ends meet. There were no silver spoon, no acting classes, and no Hollywood ties to complicate things even worse. Don disclosed that both his parents were not always present, and they were constantly under stress. And he once stated in an interview, "I had the abuse of Queen Ella and parents who divorced at the age of 12, and I was the oldest, and I was quite unhappy. Yes," he departed. "I left home at 16. Home quite early, yet despite everything that difficulties, Don didn't lose his spark. Possessed the rebellious appeal of attitude that is impossible to teach in high school. He was a little crazy and got into difficulty a lot. He was attractive, and he was arrogant, and bursting with enthusiasm, and guess what, he knew it, and he secretly desired more than he wants, just small-town turmoil. Something significant. In fact, Don maintains that having been born into such extreme poverty, these difficulties acted as inspiration to look further. He once remarked, "I had many difficulties when I was younger, not just physically but also emotionally and psychologically, but I didn't till found that's the source of the fire. In inventiveness, and that those difficulties. How did this happen, and what was the fuel? A troublemaker from Kansas becomes a Hollywood celebrity. Well, it all began in high school when he was required to take additional credits, and he enrolled in the program for drama. He did it because he had to, although the teacher noticed something unique about him. and he was therefore chosen to play Tony in West Side Story. That's where Don saw the acting bug, and the stage liked it, to put it mildly. Back in an interview he stated, "As soon as I took the stage, it was that the audience was expressing their love for me. It more than compensated for the things I failed to arrive home, so after high school, he made the decision to pursue this new dream steadily. Enrolled in Kansas University upon the receipt of a partial scholarship where he studied drama as a major, and this was the start of a lengthy and exciting journey in the entertainment industry. He ultimately departed after some time and moved to the San Francisco's American Conservatory Theater Francisco, a location where some among the top in the field. And that's as soon as the doors opened and the late Don started arriving in the 1960s and early 1970s. Minor parts in independent films and plays, not very elaborate or large, but it was unquestionably one of his earliest starts. This post-apocalyptic movie was really edgy. The film made Boy and His Dog turned into a cult favorite, and it made Don the map, even if only a small one, yet he was still years away from being famous. Don bounced for most of the 1970s around Hollywood, landing parts in low-budget movies and TV shows, places he hurried through the industry he had to contend with on a regular basis, rejections from auditions, bit parts, and second guesses. But in 1984, following over 10 years of being nearly Don Johnson ultimately became renowned. Received his big break after landing the detective Sonny Crockett's position on a Miami Vice, a brand new criminal show. Nobody anticipated that it would blow up, but when it became a cultural sensation when it was broadcast, Don was more than just a cop. He became a symbol, a heartthrob, and a fashion icon. The slick fits, the fast automobiles, which is cool. And Miami Vice was transformed into an incredibly fashionable and distinctive show that changed the way that television looked. Don Johnson was all over the place all of a sudden. Covers of magazines and music videos, and on. People weren't merely watching chat shows. Miami Vice was completely enamored with it. Started making thousands of dollars every episode, and having 5 successful seasons he transitioned from pursuing roles to purchasing estates and taking holidays in the Kansas. Boy is just like that in Europe. Without anything, turned become one of the largest on, and the stars of the eights didn't stop at. In 1986, he ventured into music in addition to acting. He put out a pop-rock record titled Heartbeat, and you can guess what it is. Removed the title tune and made it popular. And Don ended up being on the Billboard charts, and he even gave live performances and performed duets with artists such as He Was the Greatest, Barbra Streisand. Probably not the world's best singer, but Don Johnson could do anything at that time. And by the end, everyone would adore it. Don Johnson was a huge hit in the 1980s. TV show with a successful music career, movie offers worth millions of dollars are flooding in. And a glitzy yacht lifestyle designer, everything in red carpets. The story of Rich's growth wasn't merely it was stunning, it was Hollywood. People fantasize of fairy tales, yet as we all know, the more difficult the rise, the higher fall. As well as for Don Johnson, the fall was approaching quickly, don't you think? Started to commit numerous errors and poor choices that resulted in his defeat not only monetarily but also in his relationships and personal life. Don Johnson's turbulent romantic life, when Don didn't merely date when it came to romance. He created the headlines that we are discussing. A swirl of Hollywood's most renowned women, marriages, divorces, reconciliations, and even a romantic tale that inspired a film. Don Johnson's famous daughter's heart was as well known as his pastel outfits and occasionally equally chaotic. But did you know that you should begin from the very beginning? Don had roughly 5 previous marriages there were 4 distinct women. 2 of those unions were incredibly brief. That after a few days they were annulled, to date that the internet hardly understands these 2 women's identities. But Don has disclosed that among them, One was a wealthy bimbo, while the other was a dancer. It was the kind of young, impetuous love that occurs with many wealthy and well-known Hollywood celebrities. But things started to become genuine and captivating in his when he met Melanie Griffith. His love life. Melanie and Don first connected when they were rather youthful when they worked on a 1973 The Herod Experiment is a movie that friendship undoubtedly brought up some even in those days. But the two were essentially inseparable at that point. When Melanie turned 18, they became engaged. Got married in January 1976, and by July of that year, they were split up a few months later. In November, they were formally divorced in just a few months. It was enthusiastic, untidy, and completely Hollywood fashion, but with a twist. Don and Melanie's story did not stop here. Actually, they would reconcile. More than 10 years later, demonstrating that they genuinely has something unique for every. They remarried in 1989, and this when it arrived, it brought something much more massive. Dakota, their daughter, was welcomed. Johnson, who would later rise to prominence, star herself, but regrettably even by 1996, Cycle 2 was ended and everything had repeatedly, until Melanie eventually revealed regarding the difficulties that put a strain on their marriage. She remarked, "He is hardly an angel. Not simple. I find it difficult to imagine despite living without him, we are evolving in various methods." Don, however, showed that even if they had left their different paths twice as much as they had for one another was powerful, he added. "Some individuals are simply intended to be collectively." And I believe that was accurate, for so, Melanie and I were married twice. Do not think that if you are in love, when love dies it becomes into something different, so they've stayed in touch and shared custody of Dakota. And occasionally you might capture them jointly promoting their well-known daughter. But let's discuss the additional ladies, as even when Don wasn't, he was still occupied with getting married and away from prominent Hollywood interactions that were quite complex. Do you realize that they made headlines, Don? Yes, they were a couple who dated Barbra Streisand. In the late 1980s, a full-fledged pair, they were what a Hollywood power looked like. Dazzling, strong, and surprising couple, but it wasn't intended to endure, and he dated model Patty D'Arbanville, an actress, and she ended up being his lifelong girlfriend. They lived together in the early 1980s. Together for a few years, but they never married, but they did have a kid. Alongside Jesse Johnson, who is currently also an actor, but there's also Uma Thurman. There were rumors in this instance, and they were seen together at the beginning of the 1990s. But it was really short, and it arrived with a great deal of criticism because of the age. Don's distinction from them also had a Jodie Lynn O'Keefe situation, and this one actually got folks talking about. Don and Jod collaborated on the film Nash Bridges, in which she acted as his daughter, but they quickly started dating, and a media frenzy ensued. Considering that Jod was 18, he was already in his late 40s at the time. In the end, they dated for a number of years. And it undoubtedly included a lot of backlash. Don't be afraid to date younger women, which just meant a lot of many rumors and scandal trailed him wherever he went. But following all of the crazy red carpet romances, cosmetics, and breakups, everyone was taken aback in 1999 when Don finally made a permanent commitment, and this when it got stuck, he wed Kelly Fletcher. Erstwhile socialite and preschool instructor, she came from San Francisco, and had a completely distinct atmosphere from the ostentatious Hollywood sorts he had dated in the past, and perhaps he needed that precisely to make it. At the time, Job Calaby was 27 years old, and Don was 49, yet in spite of the age difference, there they'd been together since their marriage worked. More than 20 years without any scandals, drama, only a calm and stable romantic life. They have 3 kids together, and Don frequently attributes grounding to Kelly and assisting him in growing into a better guy. Having lived a wild life for decades, she was the serene during his storm. But before she arrived, Don was depicted as leading an incredibly adventurous existence, and this way of living was the thing that destroyed him and led to his largest. Don's problems with losses. Let's face it, addiction occurs when someone rises to the same height and speed as Don Johnson. Did you know that there's generally a shadowy side behind the glitz? And it wasn't for Don only the stress or the pressure of celebrity of Hollywood, it was a significant deeper, since the world witnessed a self-assured, calm, untouchable white star Ferraris and linen suits behind the scenarios in which Don battled demons that almost ruined everything he had constructed. Yes, the celebrity became dangerous. Don Johnson's money became a mess. After that, life started to go south. One of the Miami vices that exploded was Don Johnson. Among the world's most well-known guys, he was wealthy, attractive, and in a relationship. He could practically get the best of Hollywood, whatever he desired, but with that lifestyle evolved into what some refer to as it is the drawback of being famous in Hollywood. Don started having non-stop parties, and in the party culture of the 1980s wasn't merely laid back. There were drinks and dancing, along with alcohol and many types of illegal substances. There was an abundance of temptation in Hollywood, and Don didn't hesitate to labor for extended periods of time on various projects, and he was beating when he wasn't filming clubs, hosting parties, and making people numb pressure. But in interviews he was able to. Don later acknowledged, years later, that he was exposed to these harmful vices under the influence of Hollywood. He stated, "As a young man in illicit Hollywood, partying and drug use were prevalent, and it wasn't easy to get out. Become an issue as soon as it takes time, and it resulted in some bad decisions." Yes, his indulgence in these vices and the ensuing addiction laid the groundwork for his bad decisions. It ultimately left him impoverished and made the alcohol fiscally unsustainable. Ultimately turned into his escape. It was a how to cope with the stress of fame, the isolation, and the ongoing anticipations that accompanied being a star in Hollywood. But as everyone understands that it always begins as enjoyable, and the drinking culminates in mayhem. And partying began to have an impact on everything, including his relationships and job, and by the early 1990s, even his health. Don was certain that the fissures had started to show. Was still well known, having even begun Nash Bridges, another popular series. However, he wasn't the golden boy that day. Were reports of abnormal behavior and mood swings, actions, such as one that was widely reported contentious discussion he had with the hosts of morning radio, Ron Diaz and Ron Bennington, in which he swore and threats at them while under the influence of alcohol. Ultimately entered a rehabilitation facility, despite the specifics were not disclosed at the time, but then acknowledged that he had got to the point where he was unable to conceal it was no longer there because drinking had taken control. And he was aware that if he continued, he would losing everything, including his family and career, and possibly his life. Was a difficult awakening, yet it compelled him to confront reality. Despite his hardship, had a difficult struggle with addiction that caused him to make a number of poor decisions. Don couldn't have been prepared for the devastating financial obstacles that before him, and it all started with one contentious incident that altered the entire document controversy. By 2002, Don Johnson has lost his flamboyance. He was once a hottie, but he was very well known, charming, and still operating private aircraft all over the world. Then all of a sudden, Don was in the news once more, but not for a new red carpet event or television role. Rather, it was for a purpose so unsettling and contentious even now. It remains regarded as one of the finest, strange, and unreal instances in his Don Johnson's career. In November 2002 was while flying throughout Europe. He touched down at the German-Swiss border, entering Germany, the type of location where billionaires and bankers have a fondness for extremely particular and private reasons. But customs as normal officers conducted a standard examination of his. What they discovered in his briefcase was, in reality, something really remarkable. It raised a huge red flag for Germany. Customs officials found financial records pertaining to bank accounts reportedly valued at more than $8 billion. These weren't merely tax documents or invoices, these were high-level, sensitive investment documentation and financial documents, and records connected to big international transfers. As well as this promptly heightened the suspicions of the Don. Was held by cops for interrogation and promptly initiated an examination of potential financial laundering. And things initially got really serious. Spokesman for the German Customs Investigation Bureau informed journalists. There's a reasonable mistrust of Mr. Johnson's employment for others, provided that everything is lawful, not need to move papers that are valuable this sum in a vehicle. Consequently, authorities started investigating the identities of the accounts connected to the intended use of the funds, and the true function of Don was to collaborating with global bankers. Did he participate in a plot, or was he simply the face of something darker? Right away, though, when the news reached the media, it became something completely different. Some tabloids already started making assumptions that Don participated in a crucial financial conspiracy, according to some, that he may have been tricked and unwittingly carried paperwork for dubious businesspeople. But Don made it apparent from away that he had no knowledge of any misconduct. He said that he was only traveling with commercial partners and the documents from a movie finance. He said he wasn't transferring the deal. Just papers, no money. And he demanded that nothing unlawful had occurred. Unfortunately, after researching it, German investigators concluded that they exonerated him of any illegal behavior and discarded the case many weeks later. With no charges, arrest, just a great deal of confusion, but the controversy persisted despite the damage was not billed to Don Johnson. The headlines were already completed. Vicious, the internet exploded, and for a man who had previously faced many rumors about his private life, this one was merely adding gasoline to the flames. People started posing queries such as, was Don broke in private? Was he getting engaged in hazardous side projects, or